Okay, we're recording here with Ancient Problems. Um, I, in the spirit of the spontaneous Socratic dialogue, want to ask him kind of a broad opening question, which is what is what is your view or outlook on Judaism as an identity in the world, in America and Israel? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What do you think is happening? What should happen? How do you identify? Pick that up
Yeah.
however you want.
Okay. So I feel like this is a very Jewish response. Even though I'm Jewish, I feel like I'm almost outside of it and I can kind of look at it from the sidelines, or I hope to, or float above the battlefield, as they say. But I think that, Jews are just historically like lightning rods. They're just like these very prickly people who are almost always butting up against their government. And so the state of Israel is this strange historical exception where they are the government. And of course, there's fighting among them. But I think I subscribe to the idea that Jewish people just kind of punch above their weight in a lot of the places that people think matter. And so, they can be on any side and are often on every side of an issue, but that just historically speaking, due to their capabilities, you should expect them to be making history in the 21st century. And I think that there's a major fault line occurring, especially on the left. So I'm an exception. My parents were both like registered Republicans. Um, but I will say that, the default position of American Jews has been to be libs, and that it's beginning to become untenable for some of them because there's too much internal conflict with both maintaining an idea as like a good Democrat and a good Jew. I don't
So,
know if that answers your question, but
yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, so there really is no way to concisely answer it and at the same time be detailed. Um, the
I'll cut you off for a
Go
second.
ahead.
My biggest claim is that I think that a lot of what is about to happen in the United States will be caused uh, by people who are realigning very rapidly and shifting lots of power and money in not necessarily predictable directions. And I think we saw a bunch of this, the right wing, I'm sure, would love to have sniped at, like, say, the president of Harvard for the better part of the entire 20th century. But you piss off, like, who is it? Bill Ackman. And all of a sudden, she's still at Harvard, but she's kind of been defrocked. And you saw a couple of scalps fall very precipitously. And that to me is so much more interesting than arguing over like who is going to be the next president of the United States.
Um, do you think Kamala has a chance at this point?
Yes.
And I guess why? I mean, when you say, okay, well, clearly Bill Ackman is shifting his money, Elon Musk is shifting his money, David Sachs is throwing his weight behind it. Um, if there's that shift, and then we compare the margin in 2020, which in the battleground, I mean, overall, Biden won the popular vote, but in the battleground states, it was a thin margin, 50,000 votes or something. So if all of this money is shifting toward Trump away from Biden, then how is Kamala going to reverse that shift? Who is
Well,
she going to pull?
I don't know that the money's shifting towards Trump. I'm just saying that money is shifting in the interest of like specific Jewish people. I'm not necessarily talking about the presidential election, but I mean, if you call up Harvard and historically you've given them millions of dollars and you say you're cut off or I want my last check back, that talks. And I'll put it to you this way, um, figuring out who is, like, say, the paper of record who is the university of choice, if you're, say, by either an American domestic or a foreign national, those questions are often bigger than who's in the White House. Those people decide who's in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that over time, something like Harvard has had more impact collectively than, any individual president or something like that. Um, so you mentioned that there's this aberration with Israel where Jews typically um, are not nationalistic because they don't have their own nation. Now that's changed. Um, and it's maybe an uncomfortable fit, or it's not, things haven't settled into place with that. One of the problems that I've identified really in the past year with Israel, and I've been to Israel. I didn't notice this when I was there, although, on the Birthright program, they had this very weird skit. I don't know if this is a regular part of it, but there was a woman who was an actress, and she came in dressed as, as Haredi, basically, and she started going off against Israel. She started saying, you know, Orthodox Jews, we don't believe in a state, and the Mashiach hasn't come, and this is all illegitimate. And people, in the audience started to get upset because it's like, hey, we came here on a trip to Israel to support Israel, and now you're who brought you here? Why are you? And then she took it off, and then she adopted a new character. So this was her. This was like a funny. It's pretty interesting the way they wanted to present that, of saying like, yeah, there's a lot of different Jews in Israel. There's a lot of different opinions. I think she even did like an impression of an Arab Israeli and so on. So that was their way of kind of introducing these internal divisions. But at the time, it seemed kind of like, I don't know, lighthearted, or like they basically pranked us. So it was hard to take that very seriously. But years later, looking at the demographic data and the political situation, it does now seem like, and especially recently with the Supreme Court decision, that the Haredi do need to, be part of the IDF, and that's really yet to be implemented. How seriously do you take religious division, cultural division, identity division within Israel? I know you've said in America, Jews are going to be a huge part of the conversation because they're punching above their weight. But, how is Israel going to address that problem? Is it going to do so successfully? Does Likud have the answer? Is there some other answer? Do you have any
You
opinions
know,
on that?
I don't know a ton about internal Israeli politics. I was very vaguely following the kind of struggle between Netanyahu and the Supreme Court. And, I have my sympathies. Like, I'm not a particularly political person, but I try to look at like what works and what does not work. And so, like, just the entire concept of a Supreme Court seems somewhat insane to me in any country. Like, just like the concept of it seems a little bit wild. Having said that, though, I don't know that I would say I'm like for anything Netanyahu does. I don't know that much about him. This war is absolutely fucking insane, and I can't really wrap my head around it totally. But I haven't followed them all that much. What I can tell you is that, like, my handle is like a nod to this idea that like there are really no new problems, nothing new under the sun. And so my inclination would be to say that even though I look at the Jews having their own nation there as a historical aberration, it's still a country filled with citizens. And in that way, it will probably act in the way that a lot of 20th century nations have acted. In some ways, like, just one observation I have is there are many, many reasons to criticize like Israel or the Jews or whatever your beef is, but that a lot of the people who criticize it are effectively criticizing it out of jealousy. So you'll have like these like very like white nationalist types, and they're so mad over Israel basically being like an ethno state and acting in its own interest and being somewhat apologetic about how it prosecutes war. And this is everything those guys want, and they see it and they hate it. Or you have, there's an undercurrent in the U.S. among Black people for Black nationalism, and I'm not here to really opine on whether that's good or bad. But if you like Wakanda, why don't you like Israel?
I don't know. I think the answer to that is pretty simple in that there's a perceived hypocrisy in that. It's one thing if in Armenia it's an Armenian state with an Armenian church and the citizenship laws are just sanguis and you have to be of Armenian descent to be an Armenian citizen. If that exists, and I mean, we could go down the list of different countries and find which ones fit the qualification of an ethno state, whether Armenia does or not. And tens and dozens of other countries, people aren't upset about that, and people aren't even as upset about the foreign aid thing. I know that's part of the question or part of the problem, but we give foreign aid to a lot of different
For
countries.
sure.
So I don't think that's the fundamental crux. When I talk to people who have a problem with Israel, it's fundamentally they feel that there's a dual morality where Jews come to America, they advocate for multiculturalism, they go to Israel, and it's genetic testing to determine who's a citizen. So that's the perception. Whether that's true or not is a different question. But I think like when you're I think there can be some kind of aspect of jealousy. I certainly think that that can play a role of saying like you have something we want and we don't have it, therefore we hate you. And obviously, kind of people have to take responsibility for their own situation to an extent. And if you don't, you just there is some level of envy, but I don't think that people would look at like some state in the Caucasus, like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, or whatever, which might technically qualify as a definition of an ethno state, and then feel like this envy and resentment. I think it more has to do with the fact that Jews are very involved with American politics, and as you said, the way that they have historically expressed themselves has either been through liberalism, communism, socialism, Trotskyism, whatever, which has always been, anti-nationalistic. So that contradiction makes people feel like there is, the basic fact that Judaism is not like Christianity in the sense that it doesn't feel the need to adhere to some kind of a universal standard of, if we like nationalism, therefore everyone deserves the right to nationalism, or the concept of nationalism for all peoples. That is not an inherent concept in Judaism, whereas I think in Christianity, especially, 20th century Wilsonian democracy style Christianity, that is an implicit assumption that, if you believe you have a right to nationhood, then everybody has a right to nationhood. So obviously we're kind of getting into very small groups of people fundamentally. The vast majority of Americans either have a positive view of Israel, or the reason they don't like Israel is because Israel isn't, liberal enough. There's a very small percentage of people on the internet who are like, Israel has an ethno state and I wish I had an ethno state, and they're hypocritical and so on. So I don't know how important those people are really in terms of policy or anything that's going to happen in the
Of
future.
course.
But
Of course.
I mean, that is the argument. That is their perspective. If we want to rag on them or argue against them, I don't know if you care
I don't.
to go into that more.
I don't like. I don't see fit to like argue with those people per se. Like it's just. I'm just being descriptive. Like. I was talking to Megan Bell on my podcast, and I was saying how there's like many flavors of like anti-Semitism, and like pretty much all of them don't matter for the most part, or most of them don't. But like, you have different like. If you are like Lebanese and you hate Jewish people, and you're from Jacksonville and you hate Jewish people, you are extremely different people with like a lot of different ideas about who the Jews are and what they do.
Yeah, Yeah, I think there are many different reasons why people hate Jews, and it speaks to what you said about Jews punching above their weight in the sense that, if you're historically, there have been communists who were anti-Semitic because they felt they were too capitalist. There are, of course, libertarians who can be anti-Semitic because they feel they're too communist, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it wasn't my intention for us to create a scarecrow or something to mutually beat up on.
Oh
But
no, no, yeah, I didn't feel that way. I was just like, I guess I don't have a strong opinion about them because it's kind of like asking me like, how do I feel about people who hate pistachio ice cream or something? It's just like
well, that's
not.
me. I hate pistachio ice cream, so we're gonna
I
have
mean,
to start debating.
there's many reasons,
We
but
have to
it's
get
not
into
like
that.
I don't feel strongly about the people who think that or the ice cream that much.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot about ice cream, but yeah. I mean, it's. I guess I don't know. There is this definitely intergenerational difference within America, where
For sure.
young people, and the question is that a fad? And if it's not a fad, does it matter, and how much does it matter? Because one of the when I talk to people who are anti-Semitic, because there are a lot of them online, and they say, they start saying how I say, like, what's your plan? What are you trying to do here? And they're like, well, we need to red pill people and wake people up, and eventually we're going to have this critical mass. We're going to take over, and we're going to right the wrongs and fix all the bad things. And I say, like, okay, well, Egypt is a profoundly anti-Semitic country. If you go onto the streets of Egypt and you ask people about Israel or Jews, you're going to get a lot of negative responses. And you can do this all over the Middle East. You can go to Jordan, you can go to Saudi Arabia. But the fact that 90% of people in Arab countries are anti-Semitic doesn't have as big of an impact on policy, especially directionally, as a democratic model would suggest, because those countries are not democratic, they're authoritarian. So to me, when people say, okay, well, we want to change policy, and so our plan is to make everyone anti-Semitic. We don't care if you're a left-wing anti-Semite, a right-wing anti-Semite, Lebanese, Mississippi, wherever. We're all part of this anti-Semitic working class multiracial coalition, and this is how we're going to achieve our goals. And I'm like, well, there are a lot of Arab people who hate Jews, and they have basically no impact on policy or diplomacy. Egypt is not going to war with Israel. Lebanon's not going. Or, well, actually, sorry, the slip of a tongue. Lebanon may actually go to war against Israel, but Jordan is not going to war with Israel. Saudi Arabia, and the reason for that is because these are authoritarian countries, and so
And
it
by the
seems.
way,
Go ahead.
those countries, the president or the head is basically the moderating force, meaning they're more moderate than the population.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I mean, continue. I have some, you said so many things that make sense to me. Yeah,
Yeah,
continue.
no, absolutely. I guess the point I'm building up to is that when I talk to anti-Semitic people and they just say, "Hey, I'd like to make the country more anti-Semitic, and that's how I'm going to achieve my goal," and I say, "Well, what you're going to achieve is you're going to create effectively a form of not Islamification in the sense of making us into Muslims practicing Islam, but it's a form of making America much more like the Middle East, where you have a population of people who are incredibly disaffected, disillusioned, dissatisfied, and hate Jews, but you have a government that effectively figures out how to manage that population in a way in which those attitudes don't have a great deal of impact on policy. And so what you essentially achieve is kind of destroying democracy in America and ushering in an authoritarian regime because, like you said, people like Bill Ackman and many others are not just going to say, like, oh, well, I guess the people don't like Israel, so we really respect democracy, and I guess we'll just, do whatever they vote for. It's like, no, they're going to say, okay, well, I guess democracy is not working. We'll try something else. That's all that's going to achieve. Now, whether or not they could even achieve such a thing is questionable, but if they did, that is my projected outcome. But I know you had a lot to respond to there, so I'll
Well,
let you
yeah,
go.
I mean, the main point, the first point I always try to make to people anytime they a fantasy that's anywhere near this, whether it's the Jews or any other group, is like, okay, why do you think that if Irish Catholic people are running the federal government, there's going to be no corruption or something? Like, what historically tells you this, that it's going to be markedly better? Like, that if you just make them not Jewish, then the people who rule you will be virtuous. This is idiotic. Like, all of history proves that having someone your, like, I do not think that because I'm white and Joe Biden's white, he somehow represents me in the fucking government. This is the craziest fucking idea. Like, I personally know a woman who is from Puerto Rico, and she has this boogeyman that straight white Christian golf course people are running the United States of America, and this is the reason that everything is shitty. And it's just always so fucking baffling to me. Where I'm like, let's say that were true. Like, this is always a stand-in for, like, I have privilege because I'm white or whatever the fuck. I'm like, what policy has this dude enacted that somehow serves me? This is nuts, absolutely nuts. But I would say this is how the majority of people perceive politics.
I would agree. That's how a lot of people perceive it, but I would defend that view. I certainly agree with you that, um, you can say, like, okay, I'm a white person, Joe Biden is a white person. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's not going to be corrupt, or that doesn't mean that Trump, because he's a white person, is going to represent my interests either. So, race and identity and ethnicity, having a correlation between the people who are ruled and the people who are ruling doesn't necessarily produce better outcomes. And there's lots of examples of what I would call minoritarian governments, say in Rwanda or Singapore,
Singapore, yeah.
South Africa, Rhodesia. There's plenty of examples where there was a minority in power and it did its best job to protect people's civil rights and some form of meritocracy, and basically everybody was better off. And then moving to a majoritarian ethno-nationalist model where you put black people in charge of everything, that doesn't necessarily decrease corruption. That doesn't necessarily make the lives of black people better. But at the same time, I do think that any significant military power, which is what the United States is, we're not talking about Singapore. We're not talking about some, economic zone here. I mean,
We're an empire.
Yeah, the United States is an empire, and I would compare it to historical empires, whether that was Alexander the Great or the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire. Machiavelli writes about this problem of mercenaries in Renaissance Italy, where you've got a bunch of rich people in these republics, and they think it's a great idea to just spend their money to hire professional soldiers rather than forming their own militias. And what they find out is that these people are not loyal to Vienna, or they're not loyal to the Pope or something. It's like they're loyal to the paycheck, and that creates a very chaotic, violent situation. Now, I'm not suggesting that mercenary warlords are going to take over America just because we have different types of ethnicities in our ruling class, but it is to say that when you're dealing with a really large, complicated empire, which is supported by this military, if you don't have some degree of ideological coherence about what an American is and what we're fighting for and why it's worth dying for this country, if at some point you don't have that level of loyalty, then that's a huge security vulnerability. And that's not just like a modern...
I totally agree with this. I will say the other element, though, is whereas I was just talking about, like, say, the ethnicity of the president, I think you're talking about, say, like, basically importing barbarians or something, or like importing people to serve in the military, which we are doing, but that's not like necessarily a part of the cocktail when this girl is insinuating that I'm somehow running and benefiting from the way the federal government works.